Imagine you're standing right on the sprawling wooden flight deck of the flagship Akagi.
Mm-hmm.
The time is exactly 10:20 in the morning. It's June 4th, 1942. You're surrounded by the sights, the deafening sounds, and just this sheer, vibrating mechanical power of those formidable naval force on the planet.
The absolute apex predators.
Right. And for 6 unbroken months, your fleet has been completely, unquestionably invincible. I mean, you were there at Pearl Harbor when the war began. You swept triumphantly through the Indian Ocean, just kind of swatting away the British Royal Navy as if they were a minor annoyance. Every single enemy you've encountered has been effortlessly brushed aside.
Yeah, perfect record.
Exactly. And below deck right now, in these cavernous hangars, your planes are being armed for the final decisive blow against the American fleet. You've weathered their pathetic, uncoordinated countermeasures all morning long. The sky above you is clear. You think the worst is over.
You're practically celebrating already.
You genuinely believe this is the moment of ultimate final triumph for the Empire. And then in exactly 5 minutes, you discover just how fatally wrong you are. Because in just 300 seconds, you were engulfed in a terrifying, inescapable storm of fire and burning steel.
Yeah.
You watch firsthand as the undisputed apex predator of the oceans is utterly, completely annihilated.
It really remains one of the most stunning, most violent reversals of fortune in all of military history. And today, for this deep dive, we're taking a massive stack of historical accounts, declassified tactical analyses, and these really harrowing eyewitness records to look at the Battle of Midway, but strictly from the Japanese perspective.
Yeah, switching the lens.
Exactly. We are going to meticulously examine how an unstoppable military juggernaut actively authored its own catastrophic downfall. And it was through this potent, toxic mixture of tactical inflexibility, institutional overconfidence, and, honestly, one of the most brilliant, high-stakes, code-breaking operations ever executed. But I think it's vital to establish right at the top that this isn't just some dry historical recitation about ships sinking in the Pacific.
No, not at all. We are looking at the psychology behind the disaster.
Yes. This is a profound, terrifying case study in human psychology. It's about how incredibly complex systems fail and how deeply ingrained institutional arrogance can blind otherwise brilliant minds to blatantly obvious dangers.
Right in front of them.
Right. By understanding exactly why the undisputed, battle-tested military experts of 1942 failed so spectacularly, you can start to spot the blind spots, the overconfidence, and the flawed assumptions in your own life. Your own career or your own organization today.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to really comprehend the sheer paralyzing shock of Midway for the Japanese High Command, we can't just jump straight to the sinking ships. We have to start by building up that massive mountain of supreme confidence they were standing on in the first place.
The foundation of the whole thing?
All right, we need to talk about the Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet, led by Vice Admiral Nagumo. Now, you listening likely already know the basic mechanics of what an aircraft carrier is and does, but the Kido Butai wasn't just a collection of ships that happened to sail near each other. They were a completely revolutionary tactical innovation, right?
Oh, absolutely. They were the absolute tip of the spear, and their operational doctrine was entirely unprecedented for the era. Prior to the Kido Butai, navies typically viewed aircraft carriers as individual scout units. You'd maybe attach one or two to a battleship group just to act as eyes in the sky. But the Japanese took 6 massive fleet carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, the Shokaku, and the Zukaku, and they massed them together into a single, unified striking fist.
Which was unheard of.
Completely. They were concentrating their air power to project devastating, overwhelming force anywhere on the globe. And the sheer power of that concentrated force was staggering.
And it wasn't just the machinery either. The sources make a huge point about the personnel. These were not green recruits fresh out of boot camp. The aviators flying these planes were the absolute elite of the elite.
That really cannot be overstated. The Japanese naval aviator training program, the Yokoren, was notoriously brutal. It was highly, highly selective. They were turning away thousands of applicants just to find a handful of men with the perfect reflexes, vision, and stamina.
Like professional athletes.
Very much so. Before a Japanese pilot in 1941 even touched combat maneuvers, they had hundreds of hours of flight time. Many of these pilots were seasoned veterans of the long, grueling war in China. They'd been flying actual, intense combat missions for years, while their American counterparts were still doing, peacetime textbook exercises.
I read a detail that really puts their skill into perspective for me. They could launch a coordinated strike package of over 100 aircraft in less than 10 minutes.
That's right, 10 minutes.
I mean, think about the physical choreography required to pull that off. You have highly volatile machines, massive spinning propellers, armed bombs, and you are shuffling them around a pitching, rolling wooden deck in the middle of the open ocean. You're launching them into the wind one after another with zero margin for error. Doing that in under 10 minutes is a level of lethal efficiency that the U.S. Navy was still desperately struggling to figure out.
It was a well-oiled machine of destruction, and their conquests right after Pearl Harbor completely proved it. They supported massive amphibious invasions across the vast expanse of the Pacific. They utterly dismantled Allied naval power at the Battle of the Java Sea. And then, and this is a crucial prelude to Midway that often gets overlooked, in April of 1942, Admiral Nagumo led a 5-carrier force into the Indian Ocean.
Right, the Indian Ocean raid.
They swept in, completely outmaneuvered the British Royal Navy, and sent the British aircraft carrier HMS Hermes and 2 heavy cruisers to the bottom of the sea. And they did it with an ease that honestly bordered on casual. They proved unequivocally that absolutely no corner of the newly expanding Japanese empire was beyond their reach.
But wait, a winning streak like that doesn't just build confidence, it breeds complacency. I mean, elite forces eventually take losses. It's inevitable in war. Did they really think they were completely untouchable?
What's fascinating here is how this unbroken chain of conquests created a highly dangerous, totally measurable psychological condition within the Japanese high command. Later on, Japanese officers would diagnose this condition with a very specific clinical term. They called it sensorbyo, which translates to victory disease.
Victory disease. Wow, that's a chilling term.
It really is. It wasn't just a fleeting feeling of pride or your standard military cockiness. It was a deep-seated institutional rot. Because they had never known defeat, they began to genuinely believe their pilots were naturally inherently superior to the Allies. They believed their fighting spirit, their Yamato Damashi, was an invincible shield that could overcome literally any material or tactical disadvantage. They assumed their operational plans were entirely flawless by default.
How did that actually manifest, though? Did they just stop practicing?
It manifested in their daily logistics and their operational planning. Victory disease physically infected their strategic execution. Because they assumed the enemy was weak and demoralized, they started skipping the boring, tedious parts of warfare.
Like what?
Like logistics. They wouldn't bring enough oilers for refueling because they assumed operations would wrap up quickly. They assumed the Americans were so thoroughly terrified after Pearl Harbor that they wouldn't even mount a serious defense. Victory disease blinded them to calculated risks and caused them to wave off glaring logistical warnings that, under normal circumstances, would have set off massive alarm bells.
It makes me think of a gambler on a massive, unprecedented winning streak in a high-stakes casino. You sit down at the blackjack table, and you win the first 10 hands in a row.
Okay.
Suddenly, you aren't just happy.
Yeah.
You start believing you have this magical cosmic connection to the cards.
Yes.
You start betting your entire life savings on every single hand, completely convinced that the universe is just rigged in your favor. You stop looking at the basic odds, you stop playing the mathematical strategy, and you just blindly trust your own mythology.
That is a phenomenal analogy. The men of the Kido Butai knew they were the best in the world. They had the combat records to prove it. They had never lost, so they simply, literally couldn't imagine a scenario where they ever would. That supreme, unshakable confidence, that absolute certainty of their own invincibility is exactly what followed them on the long voyage across the Pacific to a tiny, seemingly insignificant atoll named Midway.
I want to pause here and ask you, the listener, to reflect for a second. Think about a time in your own life, maybe early in your career or during a major project at work, where early, incredibly easy success made you just a little bit sloppy. A time when you started skipping the safety checks or you blew off the necessary prep work because you felt like you just couldn't fail. That's a micro version of victory disease. And for the Japanese Empire in 1942, it was a terminal diagnosis.
Well said. And to fully understand how that disease manifested into the catastrophic plan for Midway, we have to look at the architect of the operation, the brilliant, highly revered, but ultimately reckless commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, Admiral Yamamoto.
Yamamoto is such a complex figure. He's often portrayed in popular history as this sort of stoic mastermind, but the sources paint a very different picture. Despite all these massive victories across the Pacific, Yamamoto was actually deeply anxious. He was one of the very few officers in the high command who wasn't totally blinded by victory disease. And that's because he actually knew his enemy.
Precisely. Yamamoto had lived and studied in the United States. He studied at Harvard. He spent time as a naval attaché in Washington. He traveled the country. He played high-stakes poker with Americans, and he saw the steel mills of Pittsburgh and the auto plants of Detroit with his own eyes. Because of that direct personal experience, he understood America's raw industrial power in a way that many of his more isolated, insular colleagues in Tokyo just fundamentally did not comprehend.
He knew they had woken a sleeping giant.
Yeah. He knew, with absolute mathematical certainty, that Japan had a very, very narrow window to win this war. He knew that if the conflict dragged on into a war of industrial attrition, America's manufacturing engine would fully roar to life and literally bury Japan under an avalanche of newly minted ships, planes, and munitions. Yamamoto was fundamentally operating on a terrifying ticking clock.
Right, because even though Pearl Harbor was a tactical masterstroke, it was a strategic failure, wasn't it? The American aircraft carriers weren't in port that morning. They escaped.
Exactly. And as long as those American flat tops were out there roaming the Pacific, the U.S. Navy remained a dagger pointed directly at the heart of Japan's new empire. Yamamoto was obsessed with the concept of the Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine.
What exactly did that entail?
Japanese naval strategy heavily relied on the idea of luring the enemy fleet into one single, massive, apocalyptic clash where superior Japanese tactics and fighting spirit would wipe out the enemy in an afternoon, forcing them to the negotiating table. He needed to force the American carriers into that decisive battle before American industry could replace them.
But the U.S. fleet was generally avoiding a massive head-on confrontation at that time. They were picking their spots. So what changed? Why the sudden rush to attack Midway specifically?
The Doolittle raid happened.
April 1942.
Yeah.
American B-25 bombers are launched off the deck of the carrier USS Hornet. They fly over the ocean, and they drop bombs on Tokyo itself.
From a purely material and tactical standpoint, the damage from the Doolittle raid was incredibly light. A few factories hit, some civilian casualties, but psychologically, it was a profound, earth-shattering humiliation for the Japanese high command. You have to understand the cultural implications here. The emperor's safety was paramount. The fact that enemy bombers had penetrated the skies over the homeland and threatened the emperor proved that Yamamoto's deepest fears were correct. The homeland was vulnerable.
It proved those American carriers were an existential threat that absolutely had to be neutralized immediately. It wasn't just a strategic goal anymore. It was a matter of national honor.
And thus, Operation MI was born. In Yamamoto's mind, this was going to be the grand finale, the decisive battle of the entire war. But the plan he came up with, it was a masterwork of overcomplexity. It was designed as a perfect, incredibly elaborate trap to lure what was left of the U.S. Pacific Fleet to its total destruction.
Let's break down the sheer madness of Operation MI. The bait for the trap was the invasion of Midway Atoll. Now, Midway is essentially just a tiny speck of coral and sand in the middle of the Pacific. But it was an American outpost so strategically vital, sitting right between Asia and Hawaii, that Yamamoto was absolutely certain the U.S. Navy would have no choice but to sail out from Pearl Harbor to defend it.
And when they did, the full, crushing strength of the combined fleet would be waiting in the shadows to spring the trap. But the way Yamamoto organized this fleet is where we see the fatal flaws begin to compound. Operation MI was a classic, quintessential example of Japanese naval doctrine, which strongly favored these highly intricate, multi-part, almost operatic operational timetables.
Operatic is a great word for it. Let's look at the pieces on the board. First, you have a diversionary force sailing way up north into the freezing, foggy waters of Alaska to attack the Aleutian Islands. The entire point of this force was just to make noise and try to draw American ships away from the real target. Then you have an entirely separate invasion force transports carrying thousands of troops sailing from a different direction to actually land on and capture Midway Atoll.
Then you have the main striking arm, Vice Admiral Nagumo's Kido Butai with the 4 veteran carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their job was to sail ahead of the invasion force, launch a massive airstrike to neutralize Midway's land-based air defenses, and then loiter in the area, waiting to ambush the American fleet when it inevitably rushed to the rescue.
And finally, trailing hundreds of miles behind everyone else, just sort of creeping along out of sight, was the main body of the fleet. This included Yamamoto himself, sailing on the brand-new super battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed. He was just waiting back there to sail in, mop up the survivors with his massive guns, and complete the operation.
If we look closely at this sprawling map of moving pieces, the fatal flaw is glaringly obvious: overcomplexity. This plan depended entirely on the perfect, flawless timing of separate, distinct fleets spread out over hundreds and hundreds of miles of open, featureless ocean. And here is the absolute kicker to maintain the vital element of surprise. To ensure the Americans didn't realize they were sailing into a trap, all of these separate Japanese fleets had to maintain strict, total radio silence.
Wait. So you have a plan that requires perfect synchronization across thousands of miles of ocean, and they aren't allowed to even talk to each other. Doesn't that completely doom the complexity of the operation from the start? If one thing goes wrong, how do they adjust?
They couldn't. They explicitly could not communicate. They could not adjust on the fly. They could not mutually support each other if something went sideways. Nagumo's aircraft carriers, which were the main striking arm and the absolute most important vulnerable part of the entire operation, were effectively isolated and out there entirely on their own. They were the bait and the trap all at once.
That is terrifying.
It was. Japanese naval doctrine heavily prioritized pre-planned, rigid timetables over dynamic, real-time communication. Yamamoto's deep-seated fear of American industrial capacity forced him into this desperate now-or-never mentality. He designed a plan that required absolutely everything to go exactly right, with a terrifying zero margin for error.
And as anyone who studies history knows, in war, nothing ever goes exactly right, especially when your enemy is reading your mail. Which brings us to the invisible shield, the code breaking, and the staggering intelligence failures that doomed the Japanese before the first shot was even fired.
The Japanese high command assumed they were operating under a cloak of total, impenetrable secrecy. But the reality of American intelligence was completely, shockingly different.
Right. The foundation of Yamamoto's entire, incredibly complex trap rested on a single massive assumption that the main Japanese naval code, known as JN-25, was highly secure. They genuinely believed it was uncrackable. They were fatally wrong.
We have to talk about Station HYPO. This is one of the most fascinating micro-stories of the war. You have these American code breakers stationed in Hawaii, working in a damp, freezing, windowless basement they affectionately called the dungeon. They're working under immense, suffocating pressure. The operation is led by Commander Joseph Rushford, who famously padded around this freezing basement in a smoking jacket and slippers, functioning on no sleep, practically living on black coffee.
And Rushford and his team at Station HYPO were performing absolute miracles of cryptanalysis. JN-25 wasn't just a simple substitution cipher. It was an additive super encryption system. Essentially, a code clerk would look up a word in a massive code book to get a 5-digit number, and then they would mathematically add another randomly generated 5-digit number from a separate secret book on top of that.
Yeah, the complexity is mind-boggling for the 1940s.
Totally. To break it, the Americans had to strip away the random additive, figure out the underlying codebook number, and then figure out what that number meant. It required early IBM punch card sorting machines and sheer, exhausting human intuition.
But they did it. By May of 1942, they had largely cracked the latest version of JN-25. They were reading significant portions of top-secret Japanese naval traffic. The Americans knew a massive operation was coming, they knew the rough composition of the fleets involved, and they knew the target was a location designated in the Japanese messages simply as AF.
But knowing AF was a target wasn't enough to commit the entire remaining U.S. Pacific Fleet. Washington Command needed absolute proof of what AF actually was. Rushford strongly suspected it was Midway, based on historical traffic patterns, but he had to prove it. And this leads to one of the most brilliant high-stakes intelligence traps ever devised.
The water shortage trick? I love this detail. The Americans decided to use the Japanese intelligence-gathering apparatus against itself. They sent a secure underwater cable message to the base commander at Midway Atoll, ordering him to deliberately broadcast a fake, unencrypted radio message claiming that the island's water distillation plant had broken down and they were suffering a severe, critical water shortage.
It was a masterful, highly tense piece of deception. They cast the bait into the water, and they waited to see if the Japanese would bite. And shortly after that fake, unencrypted message went out over the airwaves, the American code breakers in the dungeon intercepted a brand new, highly urgent Japanese message, fully encrypted in JN-25. Rushford's team feverishly decrypted it. The message urgently informed Japanese Naval Command that Target AF was experiencing a severe water shortage, and that the invasion force should plan to bring extra desalination equipment.
The traps snapped shut. They caught them red-handed.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It explicitly, undeniably confirmed that AF was Midway. The Americans didn't just know a vague attack was coming. They knew exactly where it was coming, they knew when it was coming, and they knew exactly what forces Yamamoto was bringing. So while the Japanese fleet sailed across the massive expanse of the Pacific in strict total radio silence, genuinely believing they were invisible ghosts of the sea, American Admiral Chester Nimitz was already quietly, surgically positioning his own heavily outnumbered carriers to spring a devastating countertrap.
He was sending his forces to wait in ambush north of Midway, a position they called Point Luck.
Okay, so the Americans are playing 4D chess in a basement in Hawaii. But what is the Japanese intelligence apparatus doing during all of this? Because surely they must have had some way of verifying if their trap was actually working, right?
This is where the Japanese execution completely falls apart. While Station HYPO was pulling off an intelligence masterclass, the Japanese intelligence operations were suffering a complete, catastrophic systemic meltdown. First, they had planned something called Operation K. This was supposed to be a long-range reconnaissance flight using massive flying boats. They were supposed to fly from the Marshall Islands, refuel from submarines at a tiny atoll called French Frigate Shoals, and then fly high over Pearl Harbor to physically look down and confirm if the American aircraft carriers were actually sitting in port.
A crucial piece of the puzzle. If the carriers are in port, the trap works. If they aren't, the trap is blown. What happened to Operation K?
It was canceled. When the Japanese submarines arrived at French Frigate Shoals to set up the refueling point, they found American ships already stationed there. Rather than report this highly suspicious American presence up the chain of command, which would have broken radio silence and likely raised massive red flags about American foreknowledge, the submarine commanders simply quietly aborted the mission. The reconnaissance flight never happened.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
But it gets worse, right? They also plan to set up a massive picket line of submarines across the Pacific, specifically to spot the American carriers as they left Hawaii and sailed toward Midway.
Yes, the submarine cordon. But due to immense bureaucratic delays, sluggish logistics, and poor overall coordination, the Japanese submarines arrived at their designated stations days later than the operational timetable required.
Meaning, the American ships, which Nimitz had already dispatched to Point Luck, had literally already sailed right past the intended picket line before the submarines even got there.
Exactly. The American fleet sailed right through the empty ocean where the Japanese submarines were supposed to be waiting. So, because of these cascading failures, the Japanese fleet is sailing toward Midway with the absolute, unquestioned, totally false belief that the American carriers are still safely tied up at the docks in Pearl Harbor.
But perhaps the most grievous, arrogant intelligence failure was their massive underestimation of American resilience and repair capabilities. Let's talk about the USS Yorktown.
During the Battle of the Coral Sea, just 1 month prior, in May 1942, the Japanese had inflicted severe, highly destructive damage on the American aircraft carrier USS Yorktown. She took a direct bomb hit that penetrated deep into her hull. Japanese intelligence, heavily influenced by victory disease, confidently and arrogantly reported to high command that the Yorktown was either permanently sunk or, at the absolute very least, crippled so severely that she would be sitting in a dry dock for over 6 months.
But the reality on the ground was a miracle of engineering. The Yorktown limped back into Pearl Harbor trailing an oil slick, and in an incredible, superhuman, almost desperate effort, over 1,400 repairmen swarmed the ship. They worked around the clock in rolling shifts. The ship was still in dry dock, with welding torches blazing and hammers swinging while she was actively taking on provisions and ammunition for the battle. They essentially patched her up in a matter of 72 hours.
Which fundamentally changed the strategic math of the entire battle. Instead of facing only 2 operational American carriers like Yamamoto's plan expected, the Kido Butai was sailing straight into a buzzsaw of 3 fully operational, highly motivated U.S. carriers.
All of these real-world intelligence failures represent a massive system breakdown. But to truly understand the sheer depth of victory disease, we have to look away from the ocean for a moment and look at the pre-battle war games that took place aboard the massive battleship Yamato back in May, weeks before the fleet ever set sail. When I read this part of the sources, my jaw literally dropped. This has to be one of the most chilling, mind-blowing details in the entire historical record of the war.
It is the ultimate example of institutional blindness. Before any major operation, the Imperial Japanese Navy held exhaustive, highly detailed tabletop war games. The top brass gathered in a massive room aboard the Yamato, rolling dice and moving ship models across huge maps to simulate the upcoming Midway operation. During this simulation, a junior officer who was tasked with role-playing the American side actually managed to anticipate the Japanese strategy. He launched a surprise, massive flank attack on the simulated Kido Butai with land-based bombers while they were vulnerable.
What happened?
The rules of the wargame were strictly followed. The dice were rolled to calculate probabilities, the simulated damage was mathematically calculated, and the attack was officially ruled by the umpires to have scored 9 direct bomb hits, successfully sinking 2 of Admiral Nagumo's precious aircraft carriers, specifically the Akagi and the Kaga.
Wait, back up. Stop right there. 2 fleet carriers destroyed on the tabletop simulation. That is an unmitigated disaster. There's a massive screaming red flag right in the middle of their grand planning session. The simulation literally told them their plan had a fatal vulnerability. How did the command staff react?
The room fell dead silent. And then the chief umpire of the war games, Rear Admiral Ugaki Mate, who was Yamamoto's chief of staff, stepped forward. He looked at the board, looked at the sunken ships, and simply decided that such a highly effective American attack was mathematically and practically unlikely. He declared that the junior officer had rolled too well. And then, Ugaki literally, physically overruled the simulation. He unilaterally reduced the number of bomb hits from 9 to 3. He magically erased the catastrophic damage, declared the Kaga only slightly damaged, and put the sunken Akagi right back on the board as fully operational.
I can't even process that. They literally wiped the sunken ships off the board. How does anyone in that room keep a straight face? How does an incredibly strict military organization allow an admiral to just mandate a different reality because he didn't like the outcome of the math?
You have to understand the deeply entrenched, rigid hierarchy of the Japanese officer corps at the time. A junior officer does not question the chief of staff. And more importantly, it highlights the terrifying power of confirmation bias operating at an institutional level. The glaring flaws in their overcomplex plan were right there, literally printed on paper in front of them. The fatal vulnerabilities were mathematically proven during their own rigorous simulation, but victory disease caused the highest levels of leadership to literally erase reality just so it would perfectly fit their preferred narrative of invincibility. They didn't want to deal with the messy, inconvenient reality of a robust thinking enemy, so they just mandated success from the top down.
They erased reality on a piece of paper in a comfortable room. But just a few weeks later, when the sun actually rose over the vast Pacific on June 4th, reality was going to punch them directly in the mouth, and no eraser in the world could save them.
Which brings us to the morning of the battle itself. The fog of war descends, leading to a morning defined by utter chaos and fatal, paralyzing indecision.
Let's walk through this timeline very carefully, chronologically, because this is where the tension just tightens like a vice around Nagumo's neck. It is 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, 1942. It's pitch black. The massive decks of the Kido Butai roar to life. In that stunning trademark display of mechanical efficiency we talked about earlier, they launched their massive first strike force. 108 aircraft dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and 0 escorts are launched into the dark sky in just 7 minutes. Their mission is straightforward. Fly to Midway Island, bomb its runways, neutralize its air power, and clear the way for the impending ground invasion.
But importantly, as those 108 planes group up and fly off toward the island, Admiral Nagumo strictly, rigidly follows Yamamoto's master plan. He holds exactly half of his total aircraft back on the carriers, keeping them in reserve on the hangar decks. And crucially, these reserve planes are meticulously armed with heavy torpedoes and highly specialized armor-piercing bombs. They are explicitly armed for ship-to-ship naval combat, waiting for the American fleet to inevitably show up, just as the master plan dictated.
Right, so Nagumo has his guard up. He's ready for a naval battle. And very soon after the sun comes up, the Japanese fleet comes under attack from American countermeasures.
Yeah.
Now, these are not the American carriers. These are desperate, uncoordinated, almost suicidal strikes from planes based on Midway Atoll itself. We're talking about unescorted Army B-26 bombers rigged with torpedoes and obsolete Marine Corps Vindicator dive bombers. They throw themselves at the massive Japanese fleet.
And they are completely, horrifically outmatched. The veteran Japanese Zero fighter pilots flying combat air patrol above the fleet simply tear the incoming American squadrons apart. And whatever few planes manage to slip through the lethal swarm of Zeros are met by an absolute solid wall of naval anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese battleships and cruisers. The result of these frantic morning attacks, 0 hits on Nagumo's ships. Complete destruction of the attacking American forces.
From the bridge of the flagship Akagi, standing there smelling the cordite and watching the American planes fall from the sky in flames, it must have looked exactly like the war games predicted. It looked like just another easy, inevitable Japanese victory. The apex predator was swatting away annoying flies. But then, at exactly 7 a.m., a radio message arrived from the strike force hitting Midway that began to completely unravel the entire intricate tapestry of their grand plan.
It was a message from the leader of the Midway Strike Force, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga. His report over the radio was incredibly blunt and devastating to the operational timetable. He simply stated, "There is a need for a second attack. The first strike of 108 planes hadn't been enough. The island's runways were cratered, but the defenses were still highly operational, and it was still a potent threat to the invasion force."
And this seemingly simple radio message from Tominaga plunges Admiral Nagumo into an agonizing, impossible dilemma.
Let's truly analyze his position here, because history often judges Nagumo harshly, but his choices were logical based on the terrible information he had. On one hand, Yamamoto's strict, overrating written orders were crystal clear. Keep the reserve planes armed with torpedoes and ready to destroy enemy ships at a moment's notice. Do not use them for land bombardment.
But on the other hand, Nagumo's own scout planes, which had been launching and searching the surrounding ocean at a massive arc all morning, were reporting absolutely nothing. No American ships. Just hundreds of miles of empty, rolling water. So the American fleet is, at this moment, entirely hypothetical. A ghost. But the island of Midway is a very real, immediate, proven threat that just launched a bunch of bombers directly at his head.
Exactly. To Nagumo, who was fundamentally a cautious, highly methodical commander who valued concrete intelligence over gut feeling, the logical, by-the-book move was to deal with the known, verified threat, the island, before worrying about a hypothetical naval threat that his scouts simply couldn't find. He couldn't leave the invasion force vulnerable to Midway's bombers. So at 7:15 a.m., acting on the best intelligence he possessed, he made a totally rational and ultimately doomed decision. He gave the fateful order to the hangar decks below: rearm the reserve aircraft.
Wait, explain the technical difference of the bombs here. Why couldn't they just drop the bombs they already had on the island? Explosion's an explosion, right?
Not at all. The reserve planes were equipped with 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs. These are highly specialized weapons encased in incredibly thick steel. They are designed to be dropped from high altitudes, utilizing massive kinetic energy to physically punch through the thick armored steel decks of a battleship or an aircraft carrier before detonating deep inside the hull. If you drop an armor-piercing bomb on the soft sand and dirt runways of Midway Atoll, it will literally just bury itself 20 feet into the mud before exploding, doing almost zero damage to the surface infrastructure. To destroy the island's anti-aircraft guns and buildings, they needed high-explosive fragmentation bombs that detonate on contact with the surface, spreading a massive shockwave and shrapnel.
Okay, that makes perfect sense tactically. But we really, really need to emphasize what a monumental, grueling, dangerous physical task this rearmament order actually was. Nagumo casually gives the order from the bridge, but down below, it's a nightmare. I want you to picture the intense sensory details of the enclosed hangar decks right below the wooden flight deck. It is controlled, terrifying chaos. You have hundreds of sweating, exhausted crewmen in cramped, poorly ventilated corridors. They have to manually wrestle these massive, immensely heavy 800-kilogram steel torpedoes off the bellies of the parked airplanes.
It's all done by hand and with primitive winches.
Right. They are manually lowering them, wheeling them away on narrow metal carts, carefully storing them on heavy racks, and then wheeling up huge, high-explosive land bombs to hoist up and attach to the planes. The air in the hangar is thick, suffocating with the smell of raw aviation fuel, hot oil, and human sweat. There are highly flammable fuel lines snaking absolutely everywhere across the deck as they top off the plane's tanks. Imagine trying to completely rebuild the engine of a Formula One race car during a 30-second pit stop in a dark, rocking tunnel while surrounded by open vats of gasoline.
It was an incredibly labor-intensive, exhausting, and highly dangerous process that could easily take well over an hour to complete even under ideal conditions. And crucially, it meant that the enclosed hangar decks of all four massive aircraft carriers were suddenly transformed into a highly volatile, completely disorganized jumble of armed planes, loose bombs sitting on carts, detached torpedoes lying on the deck, and highly flammable fueling hoses. They were actively, unknowingly creating a massive powder keg right inside the very belly of their own ships.
And just as this exhausting, incredibly dangerous rearming process gets fully underway, with bombs and torpedoes scattered everywhere, the entire strategic situation changes again in an instant. This leads us directly into the tactical nightmare, the moment where the confident hunters finally, terrifyingly realize they are actually the hunted.
The tension of the entire battle really hinges on a single, crucial, infuriating delay. At 7:28 a.m., a radio message finally comes in from a scout plane launched from the Japanese heavy cruiser Tone.
Let me interrupt here because this always confused me. Nagumo has 4 massive aircraft carriers packed with hundreds of planes. Why is he relying on a scout plane from a cruiser to find the enemy? Why not use his carrier planes to scout?
That comes down to strict Japanese naval doctrine again. Japanese tactical philosophy dictated that aircraft carriers were strictly, purely offensive weapons. Their flight decks were to be reserved entirely for massive strike packages and fighter defense. Scouting and reconnaissance were considered secondary, almost menial tasks, and were legally delegated to the much slower, far more vulnerable float planes that were launched via mechanical catapults from the decks of escorting cruisers and battleships.
So they outsourced their eyes.
They outsourced their vision to inferior technology. And on the morning of June 4th, the catapult mechanism on the cruiser Tone violently malfunctioned. It jammed. Because of that mechanical failure, that specific vital scout plane designated Tone number 4 launched exactly 30 minutes late. That single 30-minute mechanical delay fundamentally altered the course of world history. Because at 7:28 a.m., that late scout plane, finally reaching the edge of its search radius, breaks radio silence and sends a shocking, heart-stopping message to the fleet. It has spotted 10 enemy surface ships.
Imagine the stunned, frozen silence that must have fallen over the bridge of the Akagi. The hypothetical ghost is suddenly real. Nagumo immediately reverses course. He shoots back a frantic new order to the hangar decks. Prepare to carry out attacks on enemy fleet units. Leave torpedoes on those attack planes, which have not as yet been changed to bombs.
Which, as you can imagine, only catastrophically compounded the sheer exhausting chaos down on the hangar decks. The sweaty, overworked armament crews, who were halfway through the grueling process of swapping torpedoes for bombs, now had to violently stop, reverse the process for some planes, leave others exactly as they were, and try to make sense of the contradictory orders. The powder keg below decks was getting more and more cluttered, disorganized, and deadly.
But the scout plane's initial report was vague. 10 ships, but what kind of ships? Cruisers, destroyers. For an agonizing 45 minutes, Nagumo is pacing the bridge, demanding clarification. And then, the final nail in the coffin. At 8:20 a.m., that same scout pilot radios again, with a terrifyingly updated report. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be an aircraft carrier.
The ultimate nightmare scenario. The real target had arrived. The American carriers were not in Pearl Harbor. They were here, and they were closing the distance fast. And this shocking revelation sparks a fascinating, deeply tragic contrast in command styles on the Japanese side. Over on the carrier Hiryu, you had Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi was a completely different breed of officer than Nagumo. He was known as a fiercely aggressive, highly proactive, almost belligerent commander.
A brawler.
Exactly. A brawler. The absolute moment Yamaguchi heard the words aircraft carrier over the radio, he didn't wait. He immediately urged Nagumo via flashing light signal to launch the attack force right then and there. Yamaguchi fiercely argued that they needed to send whatever planes they had sitting ready on the flight decks right that exact second, armed with whatever weapons they happened to have attached to them, to hit the Americans before the Americans could hit them.
Just punch them in the mouth with whatever you're holding.
No.
Don't worry about the perfect formation, just get weapons in the air. But Nagumo hesitates? Why? Why not listen to Yamaguchi?
Because Nagumo's deeply ingrained, by the book, rigorous academy training completely took over his decision-making process. Let's really break down his doctrinal rigidity here because it's the crux of the disaster. Imperial Japanese Navy doctrine strictly, unequivocally demanded that any strike on an enemy aircraft carrier must be a massive, fully coordinated attack dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and crucially, a dedicated, robust fighter escort to protect them from enemy combat air patrols. To launch right at that moment, as the aggressive Yamaguchi wanted, would mean sending his bombers in piecemeal, disorganized, and without sufficient zero fighter protection right into the teeth of American anti-aircraft fire and American fighters.
It would be a suicide mission for his pilots. And on top of that doctrinal issue, he had a massive, immediate physical traffic jam to deal with, right? Think of it like a busy airport. His first strike force, those 108 planes, led by Tominaga that had just bombed Midway, were returning to the fleet at that exact moment. They were critically low on fuel. They were hovering on fumes. Many of them were shot up and damaged. They needed to land on the carriers immediately, or they would literally have to ditch in the ocean and drown.
And this is a vital mechanical limitation of 1942 naval aviation. World War II aircraft carriers could not launch a massive strike force and recover a returning strike force at the exact same time. The wooden flight deck was either a runway for taking off or a landing strip for coming back. It physically could not be both simultaneously.
So Nagumo is standing on the bridge, staring at a truly impossible, agonizing choice. Option A, listen to Yamaguchi. Launch a weak, hasty, unescorted attack right now to maybe hit the Americans. But in doing so, he blocks his flight decks, meaning he sacrifices his returning veteran pilots, forcing over 100 of his elite airmen to crash into the sea.
Yeah.
Or, option B, wait. Recover his returning planes, clear his flight deck, bring the reserve planes up from the hangar, organize a massive textbook, fully coordinated strike force just like doctrine demands, and then launch a crushing, unstoppable blow.
But option B meant accepting the terrifying existential risk of getting hit first by the Americans while his decks were full of planes and highly vulnerable.
He chose option B. He chose to wait.
It was the logical, compassionate, doctrinal, perfectly by-the-book decision, and it was a fatal one.
It makes you wonder, how often do you, the listener, stick to the rigid rules or the standard best practices of your industry when the actual situation on the ground has completely fundamentally changed? Nagumo's absolute adherence to the rulebook, his utter inability to improvise in the face of shocking, terrifying new data, cost him his entire fleet.
While the Japanese carriers turned into the wind to frantically recover their returning Midway planes, their flight decks were completely blocked by landing aircraft. They couldn't launch any new defensive fighters, they were trapped by their own operations. And just then, a new wave of American countermeasures arrived. This marks the beginning of the violent climax of the battle.
We're entering the fateful 5 minutes. But right before those glorious, terrible 5 minutes, there is a dark, sacrificial prelude that we have to talk about. 3 entire squadrons of American torpedo bombers launching off the U.S. carriers Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet finally locate the Kido Butai. These are young men flying obsolete, painfully slow, unarmored TBD Devastator airplanes. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by John Waldron, is the most famous of these. They come in low, right over the surface of the water, desperately trying to drop their heavy torpedoes.
And it is an absolute slaughter. It is a massacre. The Japanese Zero fighters, which were flying high combat air patrol, spot them and dive like falcons. The Zeros swarm the slow Devastators. The defensive anti-aircraft fire from the battleships shreds them. Out of 41 American torpedo bombers that pressed the attack that morning, only a tiny miraculous handful even survived to make it back to their ships. Entire squadrons were completely wiped out, and tragically they didn't score a single solitary hit on any Japanese ship.
From a purely statistical material standpoint, the American torpedo attack was a total horrific failure. But tactically, it inadvertently won the entire Battle of Midway.
Because of the lack of radar. This is a crucial technological point. Unlike the American and British ships, which were beginning to equip primitive radar, the Japanese ships relied entirely on visual tracking. Human lookouts with binoculars. To intercept those low-flying American torpedo bombers, the entire Japanese combat air patrol, all those highly lethal Zero fighters, had to physically dive down to sea level to engage them. They were completely, systematically dragged out of position. They were all buzzing around just above the waves, leaving the upper altitudes, the skies directly above the Japanese carriers, completely unguarded and empty.
So the skies above them are completely empty of defenders. The American torpedo bombers are destroyed. And it is now exactly 10:20 a.m., the exact moment we started this entire deep dive with. On the bridge of the flagship Akagi, there is a profound, intoxicating sense of relief. They genuinely believe they have finally weathered the storm. The returning Midway strike is safely recovered and moved below decks. The massive, coordinated counterstrike against the American carriers is finally ready.
On the sprawling flight decks of the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu, the elite Japanese pilots are sitting in their cockpits. The engines are sputtering to life, coughing blue exhaust smoke into the ocean wind. The massive ships are actively turning into the wind, preparing to launch the absolute wrath of the Empire. They are at the absolute peak of their mechanical vulnerability, and they have absolutely no idea what is directly above them.
Because without radar, and with their entire fighter screen dancing along the waves below, finishing off the Devastators, they are effectively flying blind.
10:24 a.m. A deck officer on the Akagi raises a white flag, signaling the massive launch is a go. The very first Zero fighter revs its engine to maximum RPM and begins to roar down the wooden flight deck. And at that exact, precise, horrifying second, a Japanese lookout, staring up into the sky, screams a phrase that will echo through naval history. hell divers.
Out of the blinding, piercing glare of the morning sun, dropping from a freezing altitude of nearly 20,000 feet, 3 dozen American SBD Dauntless dive bombers materialized as if entirely from nowhere. These are the squadrons led by Wade McCluskey and Max Leslie from the Carriers Enterprise in Yorktown. They had arrived completely undetected at the exact, mathematically perfect moment in time.
For the men standing on the crowded, noisy decks below, there was no warning siren. There was no time to react, no time to launch fighters, no time to even turn the massive ships to evade. There was only the terrifying, shrieking, metallic scream of diving airplanes plummeting straight down at them at terminal velocity. The destruction that followed was breathtakingly swift, brutally precise, and apocalyptic in scale.
Let's look at the toll of those 5 minutes. The first heavy bomb slammed in the massive carrier Kaga. One bomb obliterated the ship's bridge structure, instantly killing the captain and his entire senior command staff in a single flash. But the fatal ship-killing blow was a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb that crashed straight through the wooden flight deck and detonated deep inside the upper enclosed hangar.
And remember what we established about that hangar deck just 30 minutes prior?
Exactly. It was a powder keg. It was packed end-to-end with fully fueled, fully armed airplanes, loose torpedoes sitting on carts, and massive hoses pumping highly flammable aviation fuel. When that 1,000-pound bomb detonated in that enclosed space, it didn't just cause blast damage, it triggered a massive, uncontrollable chain reaction of secondary detonations. The torpedoes started cooking off and exploding. The fuel lines ruptured, creating a massive fuel-air explosion. It instantly turned the Kaga into a raging, inescapable floating furnace.
At the exact same time, just miles away, the carrier Soryu was targeted by the dive bombers from the Yorktown. 3 heavy bombs struck her pristine deck in rapid succession. Just like on the Kaga, one bomb penetrated deep into the hangar deck, immediately igniting the waiting planes and the highly volatile aviation fuel. The fire spread so fast, propelled by the ship's own ventilation system, that within 20 minutes of the very first hit, the Soryu was entirely abandoned by her crew. She was a total loss before they even knew what hit them.
And then there's the flagship, the pride of the fleet, the Akagi. She was targeted by Dick Best, one of the American squadron commanders. The Akagi actually only took one single direct hit, just one bomb. But it was the Golden BB. That one single bomb plunged straight through the flight deck elevator and down into the upper hangar, landing right in the absolute center of the armed torpedo bombers being actively prepared for the strike. The effect was completely catastrophic. The tightly packed, heavily enclosed hangar instantly became a giant, pressurized fireball.
This specific destruction highlights a fatal systemic architectural flaw in Japanese aircraft carrier design. The Japanese naval architecture was entirely obsessed with offensive power packing as many planes and heavy munitions onto a single ship as physically possible to maximize the strike. Consequently, they severely, fatally compromised on defensive measures and survivability.
How so? How are they different from American or British ships?
British carriers, for example, often had armored steel flight decks to deflect bombs, though it limited the number of planes they could carry. American carriers featured open-sided hangars, like a modern parking garage, so if a bomb exploded or fuel ignited, the massive overpressure and blast wave could vent safely out the sides into the open air. But the Japanese practice of storing fully fueled and armed planes in heavily enclosed, poorly ventilated, unarmored steel boxes meant that a single penetrating spark could and did doom the entire vessel. The blast had nowhere to go but through the ship itself. Add in their notoriously poor primitive damage control systems. They didn't have sophisticated fire mains or trained damage control parties like the Americans, and those ships were essentially giant floating bombs waiting for a fuse.
So what does this all mean? It means that Admiral Nagumo, who just 5 minutes prior was aggressively preparing to win the entire Pacific War, was now standing on the smoking bridge of the Akagi in a state of absolute catatonic shock. The windows are blown out. The deck beneath his feet is actively buckling from the heat. He is staring blankly at the roaring 100-foot flames consuming his completely invincible fleet. The smoke was so incredibly thick, the fire so violently intense, that his chief of staff practically had to physically drag the paralyzed Admiral Nagumo off the burning flagship to save his life. In the incredibly short space of just 300 seconds, 5 minutes of combat, the beating, invincible heart of the Kido Butai was violently ripped out. 3 of Japan's finest, most irreplaceable fleet carriers were reduced to burning, sinking, twisted wrecks.
It is the ultimate, terrifying testament to how quickly the fortunes of war can completely invert. However, the fight on June 4th wasn't completely over. The Japanese didn't just surrender. There was a final, deeply tragic act of fierce defiance.
Right. One carrier had miraculously escaped the morning carnage. The Hiryu, commanded by the fiery, aggressive Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi the Brawler, who had desperately wanted to launch his planes an hour earlier. The Hiryu had been sailing slightly further north, hidden under its own localized cloud cover, and managed to completely escape the notice of the American dive bombers. With the other three carriers burning furiously on the horizon, Yamaguchi didn't hesitate and he didn't retreat. He immediately ordered a desperate, all-out counterattack with every single plane he had left.
His remaining pilots, flying with essentially zero hope of survival, followed the returning American dive bombers back to their source, and they found the American carrier USS Yorktown. They struck her fiercely, hitting her with 3 bombs, stopping her dead in the water. Shortly after, Yamaguchi, relentless as ever, launched a second, hastily assembled follow-up strike of torpedo bombers, which found the severely damaged Yorktown again and managed to put 2 heavy torpedoes into her side.
And because the incredible American damage control teams on the Yorktown had somehow managed to completely put out the roaring fires from the first attack before the second wave even arrived, the Japanese pilots returned to the Hiryu genuinely, happily believing they had successfully located and neutralized 2 separate American aircraft carriers. It was a final, defiant, incredibly brave act of martial skill. But it only delayed the inevitable doom of the Kido Butai.
Because late that same afternoon, American scout planes finally located the lone surviving Japanese carrier. A new wave of fresh dive bombers launched from the Enterprise, found the Hiryu, and slammed 4 heavy bombs into her forward flight deck, peeling it back like a tin can. The fires raged out of control through the night. Admiral Yamaguchi, adhering to the strict samurai code, chose to go down with his ship, tying himself to the bridge. By the next morning, the ship was a gutted, burning hulk, and it too slipped beneath the waves. The final, desperate remnant of Nagumo's mighty strike force was completely gone.
As the sun set on June 4, 1942, the vast Pacific Ocean was literally illuminated by the massive, towering funeral pyres of the Kido Butai. The legendary carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with the heavy cruiser Mikuma, which was bombed and sunk shortly after during the retreat, were all on their way to the dark, freezing bottom of the sea. But as devastating as losing hundreds of thousands of tons of precious steel was to the Empire, losing the actual ships was actually entirely secondary to the true, deeply irreplaceable costs of the battle.
The human toll was absolutely staggering and strategically fatal to Japan's long-term war effort. Over 3,000 Japanese officers, seasoned sailors, and highly skilled technical crewmen were killed in the fires and explosions. And among those dead were Japan's most experienced, combat-hardened naval aviators and their specialized master-level maintenance crews.
These weren't just young guys who knew how to pull a stick and fly a plane. These were the absolute, irreplaceable elite core of Japan's naval air power. They were the Yokian veterans. They were artists of aerial destruction. And the Japanese pilot training programs, which were incredibly rigorous but notoriously small and inflexible, combined with their highly limited industrial base, meant they could literally never, ever replace the sheer quality of the men they lost in those 5 minutes. The United States, meanwhile, with its massive, continent-spanning pilot training programs in Texas and Florida, and its colossal shipyards running triple shifts, was just getting warmed up.
The defeat at Midway was so total, so strategically catastrophic, and so psychologically shocking to the illusion of invincibility that the Japanese government immediately initiated a massive, unprecedented, state-sponsored cover-up to hide the truth from their own citizens.
It's almost unbelievable how far they went to suppress the reality of the disaster. The Japanese public was officially told via radio broadcasts and newspapers that the Battle of Midway was a great, glorious victory for the Empire, and that numerous American carriers had been sunk. The wounded Japanese survivors, the men suffering from horrific burns and shrapnel wounds who were pulled from the freezing water, were brought back to Japan in total, absolute secrecy under the cover of darkness. They were strictly quarantined in isolated naval hospital wards. They were treated almost like prisoners of war in their own country. They were absolutely forbidden, under threat of severe punishment, from speaking to anyone about what really happened, not to their uninjured friends, not to their military colleagues, not even to their own wives and grieving families.
And the bureaucratic deception was just as deep and insidious. To hide the sheer, undeniable scale of the material loss from the rest of the military, the 4 sunken aircraft carriers were actually kept on the Imperial Japanese Navy's official active ship roster for months afterward. To anyone reading the official paperwork, the ships were perfectly fine. Their true status at the bottom of the ocean was entirely shrouded in bureaucratic silence and classified ink.
This raises a massive, glaring question about organizational health. How can an organization possibly learn from its terrible mistakes? How can it adapt and evolve if it makes it legally punishable to even admit that those mistakes happened in the first place?
They simply couldn't. And that is the ultimate lasting tragedy of the cover-up. Because the Imperial Japanese Navy mandated utter silence and fierce denial to protect its brittle institutional pride, it never had an honest, searching reckoning with its failures. The deep-seated doctrinal flaws regarding reconnaissance, the terrible systemic intelligence failures, the overly rigid operational planning structures, the fatal architectural flaws of their carrier hangars, none of these vital existential issues were ever properly addressed or reformed before the next battle. Admitting to the flaws meant admitting to the catastrophic scale of the disaster, and the culture of victory disease simply wouldn't allow it. They chose pride over survival.
It's just wild. Midway was the undisputed, definitive turning point of the Pacific War. In a single violent day, Japan's massive, overwhelming offensive power was permanently compromised, and the strategic initiative was violently handed over to the United States. Never again would the Japanese Navy launch a major, sweeping strategic offensive across the Pacific. This single defeat set the grim stage for the grinding, horrific, island-hopping war of attrition that would follow, beginning with the desperate American landings on Guadalcanal just 2 months later, a bloody war of industrial attrition that Japan fundamentally could not ever hope to win.
Exactly. The story of Midway, when viewed carefully from the Japanese perspective, provides an incredibly harsh, unforgiving lesson for anyone studying history, business, or leadership. It is the story of how a massive, highly competent organization at the absolute, undisputed zenith of its global power, blinded by a string of easy successes and totally, fully convinced of its own inherent invincibility, can systematically author its own spectacular downfall.
It's all there, laid out perfectly. An overly complex master plan built entirely on terrible, unverified assumptions. A fatal, arrogant underestimation of the enemy's resilience and intelligence capabilities, and a single, agonizing moment of by-the-book indecision at the absolute worst possible time, which doomed the finest, most lethal carrier fleet the world had ever seen. Those 5 minutes of sheer terror over the Kido Butai on the morning of June 4th didn't just cause the loss of 4 ships. They fatally compromised the ambitions and the future of an entire empire.
It's a timeless, potent reminder. The Battle of Midway isn't just a historical anecdote about dive bombers and aircraft carriers. It is a fundamental, deeply human lesson in how unchecked pride, unexamined assumptions, and the sheer unpredictable, chaotic fog of war can bring even the mightiest, most elite organizations to absolute ruin. It highlights the desperate daily need for tactical flexibility, for constant, uncomfortable self-evaluation, and for brutal intellectual honesty in the face of changing facts on the ground.
We've covered an incredible amount of ground today. From the intoxicating, blinding high of victory disease to the freezing basement of Station HYPO where Commander Rochefort broke the code, to the chaotic, smoke-filled, terrifying hangar decks of the Akagi, we've seen exactly how the undisputed military experts of 1942 got it so terribly, tragically wrong. I want to sincerely thank you, the listener, for coming along on this deep dive with us. Keep questioning the established narratives around you, keep learning from the complex lessons of the past, and always stay intensely curious. But before we sign off, I know you have one last, lingering thought to leave us with.
I do. I want you to really mull this over on your own. We've seen how the Japanese military culture violently enforced total silence and absolute denial to protect its institutional pride after the battle was lost. But go back in time just a few weeks before a single shot was ever fired. Imagine if, during those tabletop war games in that grand room on the battleship Yamato, Admiral Ugaki had somehow swallowed his immense pride. Imagine if he had allowed the simulation to play out fairly, letting those simulated carriers sink right there on the paper map, accepting the terrible mathematical truth. If an organization can find the rare courage and the profound humility to face its own simulated failures in a safe room, could it prevent real-world catastrophes? Or is the tragic, endlessly recurring reality of human history that some empires, and maybe even some individuals, are so deeply, hopelessly bound by their own mythology of greatness that they would literally rather burn to the ground than admit they might be wrong?
Something heavy to think about. Until next time.